In layman's terms, what Bert was being accused of is being involved in a conspiracy. The conspiracy involved a client of a local bank, and he was accused of having engaged in an agreement to do things to avoid the lending limits that would have applied to that client. The things he was accused of doing specifically involved putting potentially false documents into the bank's records and knowing that he was helping facilitate a client get more money borrowed or credit extension beyond what would have otherwise been permitted. The first thing to create a defense is to try to boil that down to what are the most important aspects of your defense. And our case really got down to three basic principles. One was that Bert Taylor never received any kind of reward, benefit, bonus, special perk, kickback. There was just nothing to indicate that he received anything of value for having agreed to risk a 30-year banking career over something as small as what this was in comparison to the rest of his life's work in the bank. Number two, we were able to show and put forward that he was always doing his job in exactly the way that he had been taught how to do it. And number three, that he simply had no criminal intent. The first thing I like to do is find out from the government what is it that they believe my client has engaged in that is potentially illegal conduct. And then is there any explanation for the conduct that would exonerate the client? Or in this case, did the conduct they were alleging in fact take place? And so this was a bit unusual in that most of, or almost all of the things that I was being told were part of the scheme to defraud, part of the conspiracy, the agreements to do illegal things. I couldn't find any documents, I couldn't find any witnesses, I couldn't find any emails, nothing that would indicate that Bert Taylor had been involved in anything remotely connected to the allegations. So if you can imagine, the first thing you want to look to is what has your client's name on it, who says they saw your client around things that might be potentially hard to explain in terms of the evidence. We started there, but then I started moving out from there to say, well, okay, is the assumption that something illegal happened even correct? And when I moved into that layer of things, I knew something was wrong because I couldn't find in any of the documents the government said all this evidence existed. We just couldn't find anything that would indicate what the government was alleging was in fact what had happened. The government had to call a number of witnesses from the bank where Bert had worked. And I had spent a lot of time preparing for the cross-examination of those witnesses because they were key. They were right there with Bert day to day in the bank, seeing what he was doing, interacting with him, seeing the interactions with the people that were part of the allegations from the government. But by the time we got done with the cross-examination of the last two witnesses the government was going to put up, I felt like the jury was taking notes with the questions that we were asking, me in particular, and they were taking notes on what the responses were. And those responses were like a tour de force of why Bert Taylor was not guilty and had not done anything wrong. Good character in this case played a huge role. There was one moment in the trial when the government introduced Bert's business calendar for the last 3 years. And of course, that calendar had a lot of personal entries on it, things that he was doing. And I'd come to know Bert, and I'd come to know the documents, and I knew that there was nothing in that calendar that was going to potentially hurt Bert. The judge was getting ready to limit us on how many more people we could bring into evidence to talk about the fact that Bert had a good reputation and would never commit a crime. That just wasn't his life's work. So what I did instead was I put up witnesses who were actually part of the entries in Bert's calendar. So I turned the good character witnesses into fact witnesses. So, for instance, I had his daughter testifying about an entry on Bert's calendar where she was doing mission work over in Western Europe. Now, it was a bit of a stretch, but the judge had to recognize that they put it into evidence, they opened the door, and I just basically drove a Mack truck through. So I got to put in 5 extra good character witnesses that I never would have been able to introduce but for the calendar. So it turned out to be one of the critical issues in the case. I think this case was special to me personally. I have always felt like Bert was completely innocent. He was always very confident that a jury would see that he had done nothing wrong. And as a lawyer representing him, I felt like it was my duty to see, is there a negotiated resolution of this case that might be sufficient to eliminate all the risk, because he was looking at what in essence would have been a life sentence for him at his age if we had lost pretty much any count. If he had been found guilty, we would have been exposed to more time than Bert has to give. So there was a lot at stake, which put a lot of pressure, frankly, on us to make sure that the jury got this right. And in the end, they did. And I think the most amazing moment was the jury was dismissed. 6 of the jurors actually came back into the courtroom to shake the lawyers' hands and to hug our clients and tell them that they were sorry that they had to go through all this. And I have never seen that.